Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of My DevSecOps. Today, I am joined by Kelley Robinson, who is the developer and security advocate at Twilio. She's going to be talking about two-factor authentication in 2020, not 10, where am I living, and beyond. But before we get started, obviously, a quick introduction from me. For those of you who are new to the show, my name is Sam, and I'm the community manager here at My DevSecOps. And I'm the one sort of behind the scenes make everything happen. So if there's any talks or sessions you'd like to see, please get in touch with me on our Slack or Twitter or email or all the other millions of ways we can now get in touch these days. Obviously, with all that's happening in the world, there's a bit of more of a demand of things happening online. So really, if there's something you'd like to see, let me know. If you're watching this post-recording, please know that if you jump onto our Slack, you're more than welcome to engage with our speakers and ask questions, even though it's not live anymore. So Slack is actually the best place to engage with our speakers today. So if you're not a member, if you go onto mydevsecops.io, you can find the link there and ask questions to Kelley during the session. So yes, without further ado, I'd love to invite Kelley in. So Kelley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
We're really excited. How is home life doing for you?
Home life is good. You know, it's a weird time for everyone.
Yeah, I can agree more. Well, that's enough from me. I think we've heard enough from me today. We're all here to hear from Kelley. So I'm going to hand over to her and we'll get started.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. Thank you all for joining us today, or if you're watching this in the recording, thank you for taking the time to watch this presentation. I am currently sheltered in place in Michigan. I'd normally live in New York. It's kind of a long story. I was traveling, thought I was going to be gone for a week. It's been about 7. Like I said, it's weird times for everyone. So I hope you are having a lovely day wherever you may be quarantining, or, you know, if you're watching this after, maybe this is all past and everything is just dandy now. This is 2FA in 2020 and beyond. You know, I was laughing at Sam's misstep of saying 2010, because like, what is time really anymore? Do any of us know? But this is kind of going to talk about the modern landscape of two-factor authentication and where we can see it going in the future. And a lot of this is inspired by a lot of the discussion around two-factor authentication these days. And I haven't stopped thinking about this tweet for a couple of months now. And this is from a security researcher named Troy Hunt. He is the creator of this website, Have I Been Owned? It's a service that compiles data breaches and lets you know if your email or password has been breached. And the reality in 2020 is that we basically expect legitimate email addresses to have been seen in data breaches. I checked mine yesterday and my main email address has been seen in 12 data breaches. And, you know, that's like no fault of my own, hopefully, but this is just the reality of the world that we live in now, that we are so owned that we expect the legitimate things to be, you know, breached and that kind of thing. And Troy's project proves that simple passwords like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are still incredibly common. And even complex passwords aren't secure if they're being reused around the web. And that's because when people get access to data breaches, they can have combinations of your username and password pairs. And if you're reusing those around the web, attackers will use a process called credential stuffing to try to log into sensitive accounts and get other information about you, or buy things under your name using your stored credit cards and that kind of stuff. And this is the problem with passwords, is that passwords are no longer enough. And that's what we're here to discuss today, this reality where we're so owned that we can't rely on passwords anymore. We have to start looking at things like two-factor authentication to help us stay more secure and help our customers and our users of our applications stay more secure, and how we can evaluate the different options available, because there are different channels that you can use and there's different trade-offs between those channels. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. So my name is Kelley Robinson, and I've been working at Twilio for about 3 years. I specifically support Twilio's account security products for things like Verify and Lookup for phone verification, email verification, user verification. We also have a phone intelligence API that has a lot of like security implications. And so Twilio is a company overall you might be familiar with for things like its communications APIs. So kind of raw communication channels like SMS, voice calling, email, fax, video. We've seen a lot of interest in our video API this month for some strange reason. But I specifically support our account security products. If you are familiar with Authy, Twilio acquired Authy about 5 years ago. And so I've been working on the team that's kind of like grown out of that acquisition around user verification and identity and authentication. So I spent a lot of my time thinking about two-factor authentication, and a good chunk of my time is spent educating developers about security, especially when it comes to authentication, the different options that you have available. And this talk is going to incorporate a lot of the things that I've learned in the last few years working with our developers and our customers. This talk is not at all about Twilio. It's just kind of about the things that I have learned from working on the products that we have. So I like to start off like talking about the commonalities of what we're building, because even if you want to, ask me a question, like somebody asked me recently, like, I'm a small startup, what should I start with like for 2FA? And I'm like, that really depends. Like, knowing that you're a small startup is only like a small part of the battle here of like knowing what to recommend to you. There's so many different scenarios that you could be working with, the different types of customers that you have, that it's really challenging. There is no one size fits all solution, but I try to frame this in terms of like the things that we all have in common. And one of the things that we can assume is that our authenticated systems, that we assume that the user has something of value tied to their account. And we also assume that that user can only access that value once they have authenticated. And that's proven by some measure that they are the owner of their account. But finally, there's an assumption that an impersonator could access that value. And that's what we call account takeover, or ATO. And a lot of what we're going to be thinking about is how to make this step not worth it for the attacker, how to make sure that you're investing the right amount of technology into a solution that's going to make sure that this isn't worth it for the technology or for the attacker, but also not scaring away your users in the process. And the failure of good authentication often results in this ATO, and this is a $4 billion problem, so the industry is really incentivized to find a solution here. Most of the way that we've done this is through usernames and passwords, the authentication process, but the solution that we're moving towards increasingly is moving away from passwords, or at least adding a second layer on top of that. And when we talk about multi-factor authentication or two-factor authentication, I'll be using this relatively interchangeably. A factor can be any one of these three things, and using any two of these factors means that you're using two-factor authentication. This is slightly different from two-step authentication, so sometimes you might have a account that's protected with both a password and a PIN. That's actually going to be two-step authentication because it's only using two things two knowledge passwords, instead of using something that like a password, and something that you have, like a mobile phone or a physical key. Inherence is the third type of factor. These are biometrics, things that you are. This could be something like Face ID, or something like a fingerprint, or voice recognition, or something like that. The second factors that we're going to be talking about today all fall into this possession category. So I just wanted to frame that. Knowledge is usually what we're building on top of, and there's some challenges with implementing biometrics. Usually you want to make sure that you're implementing that at a device level, so that the biometric information that you're collecting is not getting stored on some kind of server that could be accessed, obviously not intentionally, but you don't want biometric data getting hacked or leaving a device, because you can't change that information. There's not really like the account recovery path for biometrics. So let's look at some of the trade-offs of the different factors that fall into this possession category. We're going to start with SMS-based 2FA. And so one of the huge benefits of SMS-based 2FA is just that it's really easy to onboard people. And I can't stress how important this is, because there's a really huge burden to getting people to turn on 2FA. And even if you make somebody download an additional app or take additional steps, that's going to decrease the number of people that turn on 2FA. And 2FA isn't really worth anything if nobody uses it. And so one of the reasons that companies still love SMS-based 2FA is because it does have really easy user onboarding, it's a familiar interface. But like, according to a recent Pew study, over 90% of Americans have a phone capable of receiving text messages. And so this makes it really easy for people to start using SMS-based 2FA. But SMS is not a secure channel. And you might be familiar with this as somebody that's interested in DevSecOps. There's something known as the SS7 vulnerability. This is the signaling system 7. And this is a vulnerability in inter-carrier telecom switching. And this allows you to impersonate a carrier and basically route messages that aren't intended for you to yourself. So this requires a little bit of technical know-how, but it's definitely possible. And we've seen definitely like state actors using this, and any kind of people that are motivated enough to get into a man-in-the-middle or commit a man-in-the-middle attack. You can use SS7 for that, because telecom and text messages are not end-to-end encrypted. But arguably one of the more common things that we've been seeing with SMS as a attack vector is something called SIM swapping. And this is where you use social engineering or bribery to get a SIM card. You get my SIM card sent to you. And so if you want to go talk to T-Mobile and convince them that you are Kelley Robinson and get my SIM card reset and sent to you, all of a sudden you have access to all of my text messages. And we've seen this happen. It was really popular a couple of years ago, especially when people were bragging about how many Bitcoin they had on the internet. So pro tip, don't brag about how many Bitcoin you have on the internet, but this is something that people can use to get access to your text messages and your 2FA codes. So SMS is super convenient as a method of 2FA, but it's not really that secure. The next method that we're going to talk about is what we call soft tokens. This is also known as TOTP, or time-based one-time passwords. And this is a way to generate tokens based on an algorithm. You would use this with an application like Google Authenticator or Authy. And the inputs to this algorithm are a secret key that gets shared when you set up an account and your system time. And then those get put through a one-way function and out pops the truncated token. And symmetric key cryptography is going to offer additional security compared to SMS. But if somebody gets access to that shared secret, then the method can be easily compromised. And this, you might say, like, well, how is somebody going to get access to that shared secret? Usually the way that you share that is by scanning a QR code when you set up your TOTP and whatever app you're using. One example of how this could go awry at my last company, the engineering team had shared credentials for our Amazon account. And one of the ways that we set that up was we did have 2FA turned on, but we shared the QR code for adding the 2FA in our shared 1Password file. And so we were able to scan that when we onboarded a new engineer, and we eventually moved to IAM role and more secure things for managing our AWS account. But that was one thing that we were using to make sure that everybody could have access to the 2FA, but there was QR code that was just kind of sitting around there. It was a little bit more secure because it was in that 1Password file, but it's still one of those things that it could get leaked if you are worried about something like that. But TOTP does offer some distinct advantages because both of the inputs, so that system time and the secret key, are available offline. The entire method is available offline. And so that means you can use TOTP if you're on a plane and didn't buy Wi-Fi access, if you're traveling and you don't have access to your SMS messages, say you're traveling and nobody's traveling right now, but say you lose access to your SMS, or you have a SIM card from another country or something like that, TOTP works offline, and that can be really valuable. We've seen this useful, in basements of hospitals where people might not have cell service, and if you can't receive text messages over Wi-Fi, then something like this can be really useful. Unfortunately, TOTP does require an app download, and this is one of those things that it isn't a huge burden to some people, and to some people that already have an app like Google Authenticator, Authy, Microsoft Authenticator, Duo, all of these adopt this open standard, so you can use whichever one you want. But getting people to download the app for the first time, it can be a big hurdle for a lot of people that are setting up this for the first time. And then I briefly wanted to mention the expiration user experience here. And so because this is based on system time, there's about, usually these tokens expire in about 30 seconds. And in a study on the usability of different 2FA factors, researchers found that 2/3 of participants using TOTP via Google Authenticator had problems entering the 6-digit code before it timed out. And so again, if you're used to using this method, that might not be a problem for you, but you might want to consider the expiration UX as something if you have users that might be a bit slower to enter codes or not used to using the second factor as often. So we see a lot more security conscious companies adding TOTP as a 2FA option because it's definitely more secure than SMS. For people that might be worried about getting SIM swapped or taken over via SMS, allowing those users to turn off SMS as a second factor and opt into something like TOTP is going to be something that you could look into to really delight your security conscious users. The next thing that I want to talk about is push authentication. And users love this because it's so low friction. You can approve or deny a login request directly from your smartwatch. And it also uses asymmetric key cryptography, which means that you have two keys and one's only ever going to be stored on your device. So you don't have to worry about leaking a shared secret like you might with TOTP. And this is also the only form of 2FA that adds the option to explicitly deny a login. But unfortunately, push authentication is so low friction that you could easily approve an authorization request just to get rid of it. So if you think somebody has breached your first factor and is trying to hack into your account in the middle of the night, and you keep getting a notification on your phone that says it's buzzing because you haven't turned on Do Not Disturb and you just want to get rid of it, you might unintentionally approve the request because it doesn't really take that much effort to approve a request like this. And so that could be a problem if you're worried about how low friction this is. If you really want to make sure that people are being intentional about it, having somebody enter a code is another way to do that. Push authentication also requires a special app like Authy or Duo. You could also build this into your own application. And like TOTP, getting users to download another app is always going to be a challenge. I think where we've seen this be really successful is with app-first companies, or if you have if you have a large portion of your user base that already has a mobile app installed. So Google Prompt is a good example of this, where if I'm trying to authenticate a Gmail session on my desktop, I can use the Gmail app on my phone as the authenticator and use the push authentication as a way to verify that I'm logging in on the desktop. So this seems great. It's really cryptographically secure. It might be good for some use cases, but it might also be too convenient, perhaps. And the one of the other downsides of this is it's just going to require a little bit more coding and a little bit more development time to get this set up. The next one that I wanted to talk about is WebAuthn, also known as U2F as a universal second factor. WebAuthn is another part of the FIDO2 spec. FIDO2 is specifically to get rid of passwords. So this is all about passwordless authentication. So this isn't necessarily going to be always a second factor. It could be replacing the first factor, but we still see this a lot as a supplement to passwords. And the good thing about WebAuthn is that it's phishing resistant. It offers a really high level of security with asymmetric key cryptography like push authentication, but it's also an open standard like TOTP. So the biggest drawbacks with this right now is that it's relatively new still and setup can be kind of clunky. So you need an authenticator that's compatible with the standard, and things like YubiKeys, which are pictured here, aren't exactly cheap, and it's definitely not reasonable to expect every user of your application will have one, especially if you're dealing with a consumer application. So as more devices that we already have, like our phones, start to adopt the standard, and so Google is experimenting with this with Android phones, so any Android phone can be used as a WebAuthn compatible authenticator, but right now it's still only for Google sites. But as Android phones start to be like a more common authenticator for any site, we'll start to see an uptake in this factor. Currently, it's still more popular within companies, and so your IT department could hand you a YubiKey or a Google Titan key or something like that, or they can mail you one. The other thing with these is the account recovery is a lot more challenging. If you lose the key, you're kind of SOL, and this can be a problem because, especially for consumer applications, which is a lot of what we deal with at Authy, you want to make sure that there's a path to recovery there, and there's a path to getting people that you might not have that kind of employer-employee trusted relationship with, a path to getting them back into their accounts. So I do want to back some of this up with some quantitative data. And I think to do that, we need to think a little bit more granularly about how we're measuring the effectiveness of 2FA. And I wanted to frame some of this in this life cycle approach. And so I already mentioned the account recovery there, but you also have to think about onboarding. So there is some friction for setup with some of these factors. There's also the friction for ongoing use, the user experience as people continue to use this. And there is also the friction for replacing the loss factor like I was talking about with YubiKeys. And YubiKeys are one of those things, and U2F and WebAuthn are one of those things where the setup and the recovery can be pretty challenging. So from a study in 2018 that focused distinctly on YubiKeys, not WebAuthn overall, but it was just on YubiKeys, the setup success varied a lot depending on the platform that you saw. And so Google, when people were using or setting up YubiKeys for Google, 83% of people were successful versus only 32% of people were successful on Facebook. So this study was from 2018. If you've been following WebAuthn, you know a lot has changed since 2018. But I do think it's a really interesting look at how onboarding UX can impact user success and make sure that they can either be successful more of the time like they were with Google, or less successful like they were with Facebook, or even with Windows authorization tool, more people were able to lock themselves out of their computer because that tool didn't allow them or didn't force them to do a complete authentication before they turned on the factor. So moving on to usability, one measure of usability that we see is time to authenticate. And this is really important to some people, but it's just one measure of usability here. And so in terms of time to authenticate, I don't think this is really that surprising. U2F and push had the fastest median times to authenticate. And so when you compare this to something like SMS, Duo research found that it can save people over 13 minutes every year, depending on how often they're logging in. But the System Usability Scale, or SUS, is another standard measurement used by researchers to kind of see how much people prefer different types of authenticators. And all of the methods actually had a pretty good usability score. TOTP came out on top. Of the actual factors, this is compared to passwords, which is not using any 2FA. The participants still preferred just using passwords. But looking at the actual second factors, TOTP was their favorite. And this actually surprised me because this was the same study that showed that 2/3 of the users had issues with that timeout, but that didn't seem to affect their rating here. There is somewhat of an inverse relationship between the SUS scores and the time to authenticate, though, because all of the methods had a pretty good usability score, but I thought it was interesting, and the researchers actually pointed this out, that push and U2F had some of the lower SUS scores, and this is coming from some of the fastest authenticators. And so they observed that faster authentication does not necessarily mean higher usability. There's some theories behind this. I kind of mentioned that friction is something that we kind of expect with authentication. This is something that we might be used to, and maybe we'll start to move away with this as we start to adopt more of these asymmetric key cryptography methods that are actually offering additional security but are so low friction. There's other ways that you can do this. You could use U2F in a way that does require you to enter a PIN to authorize, and so there's ways that you can start to work with these factors to introduce a little bit of friction. But I thought this was an interesting observation. But there are a lot of trade-offs between these different options. There's a lot of different levels of security here. But I think it's important to note, especially for a security-focused audience, I get into debates with people a lot about like SMS should be burned to the ground. It's not a secure method of authentication. I see like popular science magazines reporting this. But I do think it's important to note that SMS-based 2FA is still better than no 2FA at all. And I know that like this is something that I am easily biased by. Like I work at a company that offers this as a product. And so I'm constantly questioning whether or not this is just me, being biased here. But while this is easy for me to say, there is actual research to back me up. In a Google study from last May, they found that an SMS code sent to a recovery phone number helped block 100% of automated bots, 96% of bulk phishing attacks, and 76% of targeted attacks. And so that's pretty good protection, and it's definitely going to offer additional security compared to just using usernames and passwords. So while this is definitely an insecure method, and while I do think, especially depending on what type of product you're offering, you should offer additional options like TOTP or push, you definitely want to start to consider the onboarding benefits of something like SMS as a two-factor authentication channel. But like I mentioned before, 2FA isn't really worth anything unless there are people actually turn it on. And 2FA adoption, when it's optional, is pretty abysmal. And there's, a few reasons for that. The BYU study from 2019 found that people were willing to add 2FA if they saw value in the account, but 13% of participants just thought the inconvenience was too high. And one of the reasons for that is a lot of people just don't believe that they're a target. And so one of the research participants said, I just don't think I have anything that people would want to take from me. So I think that's why I haven't been very worried about it. And this makes sense. We all probably know people in our lives that feel this way. And as people that think about security, that care about security, that work in security, we understand the value of some of these additional measures, but the average person might not. And I think it's interesting because there's been some conflicting research lately about whether or not people having been part of a past data breach actually influences their willingness to turn on 2FA. And some people have found that it does influence their willingness, and some people have found that it has no effect at all. And I think that also makes sense, probably depending on the person. Like I mentioned earlier, like my email has been seeing 12 data breaches. It's something that I just kind of expect as a thing, and does somewhat affect my willingness to enable 2FA. But I think the other thing is just like, this is something that I've been working in for many years now. And so this is something that I think about all the time. And so I'm going to be somebody that's more willing to put in the time investment to set up my personal security. And a lot of people are not. But hope is not lost. Awareness and adoption have almost doubled in the last 2 years. There might be a couple of reasons for this. For one, the comparison here, the 2019 report came out in December of 2019, so I can assume that the research from 2017 was conducted towards the end of 2017. If you remember, at the end of 2017, around December of that year, the price of Bitcoin spiked, and that did inspire a lot of people to think about additional security measures for their online accounts. So that could have happened between these two measurements. But I also think one of the ways that we've increased awareness and adoption is companies are starting to get a little bit more savvy with how they're influencing people to turn it on. Because unless you're Coinbase, you probably won't make 2FA mandatory, but you do have other options than just hiding it in profile settings. So you could do something like put it in the profile settings. You're going to get a really low number of people that turn that on if they have to navigate to their settings and decide to enable it. You could prompt them at login. So when they're logging in, say, hey, we notice you don't have 2FA turned on. Would you like to set that up now? And walk them through the flow at that time. But one of the things that I think is interesting is companies are starting to do some product incentives to incentivize people to turn on 2FA. And so we know strategies like product incentives work from looking at Google search trends for 2FA. So if anybody knows what that spike from August 2018 was, you can put it in the comments. I'm curious to see if anybody remembers this. You can kind of see the spike from Bitcoin at the end of 2017 there, the small one right above the 2018 marker. But in August of 2018 was when we started to see this really spike in terms of Google trends for 2FA searches. All right, I will break the suspense. This was when Fortnite decided to offer in-game incentives for its users to turn on 2FA. And I thought this was a really clever thing because if you're familiar with Fortnite at all, it's like the most popular game on, for gamers a lot of times, especially for the teens, or at least it was at this time in late 2018. And so them offering incentives really, really spiked awareness for a lot of people. And now, even almost 2 years later, 3 of the top 5 related search queries to 2FA have to do with Fortnite. Epic Games is the company that owns Fortnite. But Fortnite isn't the only ones that are offering incentives, even though actually I think just 2 days ago they started offering another incentive. It's like a time-boxed incentive. So Epic Games was saying, hey, if you want to download any of our free games, you have to turn on 2FA in order to get access to our free games. And I thought that was a really clever thing. They expired it sometime in May. And that was something that is going to incentivize a lot of people to turn on that feature and hopefully prevent the amount of account takeover. We've seen a lot of gaming companies start to do this because there's a lot of fraud that happens within gaming companies, but they aren't the only ones offering incentives. Companies like MailChimp are offering a 10% discount for accounts that turn on 2FA. And so even if your company doesn't have something like free, like an in-game emote that you can give away to people, you can still offer product discounts. You can still offer discounts off of their next bill. There's ways that you can start to think about incentivizing people, unlocking features that might otherwise be enterprise features. There's different types of incentives that you could do depending on what your business is. And so let's take a look at how you might measure the impact of some of these features. Like everything, this is going to depend on your business, but here are some of the things that you might want to measure. So you might want to look at the overall losses due to account takeover. You probably want to see that number go down regardless. You might care about the total number of compromised accounts. You also might not. You only might want to see like high value accounts aren't getting taken over, because one of the things that you could do with this type of information is decide that, hey, maybe we do start to enforce 2FA for accounts that are worth a certain amount of money. And worth a certain amount of money might be different depending on what your business is. You could start to think of strata here for things like, maybe Twitter decides that they're going to force verified accounts to turn on 2FA. Maybe Reddit decides that they're going to force, moderators to turn on 2FA or stuff like that. There's ways that you can start to think about how you enforce or how you incentivize 2FA for different types of users. And so even if lower value accounts do get compromised, you might not care as much if those aren't actually costing you that much money. You also definitely want to be friends with support and talk to them and understand how much support is costing you for your authentication. This is definitely something that enterprise identity teams are thinking a lot about. At larger companies, you want to make sure that changing your two-factor authentication or adding additional friction, if it does introduce additional support costs, which it might, and that could be okay as long as it is creating incentive or creating a benefit for the number of losses, you want to make sure that those are going down relative to the support costs. And finally, I just want to leave you with some things that you could do in the short term to make sure that you, short, medium, and long term, to make sure that you're doing the right thing for your business and for your customers. And so some of the things that you could do this week is just take inventory of what you're already doing to protect users in your applications. What forms of 2FA do you offer at all, if any? How many users have turned it on? That's a really good baseline metric to have. And what is account takeover currently costing you? How are you dealing with that? Are you offering any kind of revenue forgiveness for that? And how much are you offering? Is that something that if you started to offer incentives to mitigate that you could offset the revenue losses, things like that, to help you get a baseline understanding of where you're at. In the medium term, if you don't already offer 2FA, SMS is a good place to start with this. But if you already offer 2FA, there's a good chance you're using SMS, and there may be opportunities to make that experience better for your customers. And in the longer term, you definitely want to start to think about if there's any incentives that make sense for your customers, for your business. And then you can start to think about adding more secure channels to really delight your security conscious users. When you do this, definitely make sure that you allow users to turn off SMS as an option, because a lot of security conscious users don't want to see that as a thing that they have access to, or they want to make sure that there's not a way to fall back to that if they're at risk for being taken over. Just monitor the ongoing impact of your changes and make sure that they're having the effects that you want to see. There's definitely not a one-size-fits-all solution here, but I like to remind folks, you just really want to be intentional about this. Consider your business, consider your users, and optimize accordingly for what you find there. Because, like the security researcher Cormac Hurley says, when we exaggerate all dangers, we simply train users to ignore us. So I hope I've given you some inspiration for how to think about your authentication systems. I'm going to be available for any questions. Once again, my name is Kelley Robinson, and thank you for listening.
Thanks, Kelley. That was great. Definitely some comments in the Slack on people sort of using 2FA and at different parts of their process. So I think definitely room to ramp up and add more security to what they're doing. We didn't have a lot of questions on the channel today, probably because it was such a lovely, well-rounded session, but a lot of great comments and things like that. And obviously, as all the community members know, any questions as they come in, you can pop them on the Slack or on the YouTube, and we can get those across to Kelley, as well as sort of the other community members are there to help and answer as well. So thank you again, Kelley. We really enjoyed having you with us.
Thanks for having me.
No problem. So yeah, guys, as a reminder, obviously, all our sessions happen once every 2 weeks. Our next session is going to be solving trust issues at scale with Omer. So if you'd like to join us, that will be in 2 weeks' time, same time, same place. And wait, I think I have a nice little visual here for everyone to see. So there are your details. So join us, please. Don't forget to jump onto the Slack. And if you enjoyed this, please share it with your friends, your teams, your colleagues. And we'd love to do more. Let us know what you'd like to see and do. But again, thank you so much, Kelley, for joining us. Bye, everyone. Have a good day.
Bye, everyone.